I am here today to talk about K.M. Panikkar and his idea of India, but in itself, that this whole subject is so vast because this man, as I found out when I began researching this book, is somebody who was present for almost all of modern India's milestones from 1915 to 1963. So that's the length and breadth of our independence movement, as well as the first 2 decades of our existence as a post-colonial nation. So it sort of was very interesting to trace the evolution of his idea of India. So, I've titled this K.M. Panikkar and his idea of India. What was very interesting to me was to sort of find out that through his writings, you can see a sort of um, evolution of that idea. You can see also that his idea of that was never a static one. Um, and in order to sort of give you more context about this, I think it's always important to take the story back to the beginning. Um, so who was K.M. Panikkar was the question that I began with when I began researching this biography, because as a policy analyst and a student of history, I have come across K.M. Panikkar as our most controversial ambassador to the People's Republic of China and to Nationalist China, as Malhar said. Um, it sort of surprised me to find him also in the Chamber of Princes. So when I was researching my biography on VP Menon, I came across K.M. Panikkar in the Chamber of Princes as well, and which is sort of how my sort of digging into all of this began, because I thought, okay, if he was also in the Chamber of Princes as well as our ambassador to China, what brought him to all these places, and what was he thinking? Where did he come from? What was his word like? What was his family like? Because if you've even had a rudimentary reading of K.M. Panikkar, you know that this is somebody who's left behind this huge intellectual legacy in terms of his writing. But about him, we know next to nothing, because apart from his memoir, there is nothing beyond maybe two sort of very point-to-point biographies on him, which sort of list where he was at particular points throughout his life. So K.M. Panikkar essentially was born in Kuttanad in Kerala, modern-day Kerala, in 1894. And the early years, it was very interesting because he was never a particularly sporty or athletic boy. He was a very bookish child. He loved his books and his studies, and he loved history. He hated science. He hated mathematics. This was a boy who, his one of his main figures in his life was his grandmother. She was the maternal figure in his life, so to speak. His own mother was sort of very disciplinarian, very intelligent, very strong woman, but very much more disciplinarian than his grandmother, who, clearly he was her favorite grandchild, and she was much softer with him. They had this wonderful camaraderie growing up. Where she would teach him the Malayalam alphabet, she would tell him stories, they would play games. You see certain figures of authority flitting in and out of his early years. So his grandmother's brother was definitely one of the stronger male figures in his life. He was somewhat of a domestic tyrant, very strong, very just man, but definitely somebody who struck fear into the hearts of little children. You have his elder brother and his mother's brother as well, who become pivotal sort of figures in his life as he grows up. Now, the reason for this is because you have a young boy who's not doing well in school. He is consistently, not the best in his class. And eventually his grandmother, his sort of outpaces his grandmother in her attempts to sort of homeschool him. So she sends him to Trivandrum to study, where his elder brother is and where his mother's brother is also training. Um, it's this moment in time that you sort of get a glimpse of what India was going through at this point. So this was in the early 20th century. India had already seen the partition of Bengal. It had seen the Swadeshi movement. It had seen the country united in the kind of nationalist fury that, the Raj had never seen before. Travancore itself was undergoing this whole phase of socio-economic reform. Um, there was a whole anti-Brahmin movement beginning as well. And Panikkar's uncle's home in Trivandrum was very much a household which sort of had its doors open to local politicians, to journalists, to writers, to poets. These boys had the kind of access to the kind of conversations around politics, around history, around emerging ideas of what India should be from a very early age. Now, all of this was a sort of fleeting moment in his life, of course, because he goes back to Kerala after this. He goes back to Travancore, like to his home after this. And he sort of bounced around between schools. He's not doing well again. But if you read his memoir, you'll see that Trivandrum stands out to him as this moment in his life where he actually was alive to so many different influences that were not there at home. The kind of conversations and discussions on politics, on nationalism, on where the country was going at that point. Um, the sort of fights in the Congress, because this was also 1907 when you had the split between the extremists and the moderates, and you have news of, this fight on the banks of the Tapti River with chairs and shoes being heard about. So these are all things that sort of stayed with a very young Panikkar. Um, and sort of played a pivotal moment in his life, so to speak, because it sort of opened his mind's eye to um, the kind of thought process that he wouldn't normally have had at home. And this is despite the fact that the Panikkar family was a very erudite, very sort of articulate, deeply religious family on its own right. They were also generationally very wealthy, which means that the boys had the chance to go overseas for education. Now, this was immensely important because it's actually from 1914 to 1918 that you see a young man getting acquainted with what an idea of India should be. So Panikkar basically is sent to Oxford. His elder brother is already in England, and his elder brother basically writes home and says, "Send him across as well. I'll look after him." So Panikkar goes across to England a few months before the First World War breaks out. And it's a very interesting time to be literally in the heart of empire, right? Because you have an England that is in an immense state of unrest. You have labor unrest, you have workers striking, you have the Home Rule Bill being pushed very stormily through Parliament. You also have definite war clouds looming on the horizon. And this is running parallel to what is happening in India at the time, right? So you have a very fiery push towards a nascent idea of India beginning to develop at this point. Um, Panikkar finds that when he is in Oxford, however, he's intellectually very much out of his depth. So where he used to cling to, the fact that Trivandrum was this intellectually vibrant time in his childhood where he was talking with, the great poets of the day, the great journalists of the day, and all of that. He gets this severe sort of shock at this point because now he is coming into contact with young men who know all about a world of politics, of literature, that he has no idea about. And you will see a certain sense of inadequacy and low self-worth developing at this point in Panikkar. Basically goes back to his elder brother and says, look, I don't know as much as these boys do, and I need to be able to read and learn and, absorb more in order to contribute to these discussions. And it's the beginning, and his brother agrees with him, gives him the money and the books that he needs to read. And it's a beginning of a sort of intellectual quest for Panikkar. He begins reading and sort of researching become his fallbacks whenever he's unsure intellectually, whenever he's unsure ideologically. You always find him returning to the root of the problem, to research, to history. This is a point at which that pattern gets set in Oxford. And Oxford at this point is it's essentially this crucible of various kinds of nationalisms, right? So you have the Oxford Majlis, for instance, which is a debating society essentially, which is the members of which are basically Burmese, Ceylonese, young Indians all of whom are debating individual strands of nationalism, what it means, what empire means for their own countries, and what a removal of empire might look like for all of them. Um, and you have the world going to war in June 1914. Now, this is a turning point for both the empire, for the world, for the colonies as well. It's at this point that Panikkar is really introduced to the heart of what nationalism means and what it can mean. And you see him beginning to write at this point. And it's an incredibly important moment because from the time that Panikkar picks up his pen in 1914 to the point that he dies in 1963, he never stops writing and he never stops investigating what the idea of India should be. Um, and he never stops asking that question, what does it mean to be an Indian? Right? In the middle of the First World War, the main questions are what does it mean to be a subject of empire versus a citizen of your own country? And by citizenship, I'm not speaking of the constitutional codification of it, I'm speaking of the ethos of it. What does it mean to actually belong to your country? What is your country, right? Because you have a world where you have your country basically sending men and material to fight in unknown countries for an unseen king. You don't know what's going to happen after the war. Do you get a reward in order to participate for your efforts to sort of participate in the war and to aid the empire? What does that reward look like? What does self-determination look like? Right? And it's interesting to follow Panikkar's earliest writings when he's in college. And this is when he begins dealing with incredibly complex themes. He starts writing about citizenship. He starts writing about global economics of being at war. What is the cost for the colonies to be at war? He starts writing about immigration. He starts writing about diaspora and diasporic rights. Now, these are incredibly difficult questions to deal with. Um, and his early writings, in fact, are a great source to begin with because you see a very young Panikkar, you see a young man who is visibly angry, who is visibly furious with racial discrimination, with inequality, uh, with having your national and fundamental rights as a citizen being deprived. And he's still sort of searching for what this means, right? He doesn't have an answer as yet. And in fact, as you follow him through the years, you will see that his answers keep getting sort of refined as India changes and as the years pass. But right now, between 1914 is probably when you see Panikkar at his rawest. This is also a point where he goes right back, right? So his idea of nationalism becomes grounded very strongly in Hinduism. And this is probably the only thing that doesn't change throughout his writings, right? So his idea of nationalism remains very strongly grounded in Hinduism, in religion. For him, that is the beating heart of India's civilizational ethos. It is the beating heart around which the country can unite. A lot of it at this point is speaking to what was known as the Greater India School of Thought at the time. And the Greater India School of Thought, to put it very simply, was this trans-imperial, very Indo-centric school of thought, which basically said, and it was an answer to empire at the time, right? It basically said, look, we as a cultural empire have been here long before the British Empire, long before any foreigners existed. Um, our commercial, cultural, and spiritual influence, particularly across Southeast Asia and Central Asia, is unparalleled, right? And we have been here for millennia before any foreigners arrived. This was in the 20th century not just Panikkar's belief, it was many young nationalists who believed that it was an easy, solid, informed answer to colonialism. Um, As the years pass, however, this is a view that becomes distinctly problematic. But what is interesting is that as far as Panikkar is concerned, while it is problematic as the years pass, and I'll talk about that in a bit, it's also important that even though Panikkar was probably at his most radical, at his most youthful, and at his most, you know, infuriated at this point, you will see that this view of nationalism doesn't cut into the Hindutva core of nationalism. It doesn't subscribe to, say, a Savarkar school of thought. It doesn't subscribe to a militant, muscular idea of Hinduism. He has this wonderful phrase that he uses very early on, which is that Hinduism has this generous vagueness, which allows for the inclusion of many different other religions, castes, communities, and classes and languages. Um, he is somebody who is very conscious as he grows up of the richness of India's history. And he makes this point it several times throughout his writings that any brand of Indian nationalism is incomplete if it does not take into account India's natural plurality and diversity. And he makes this point very early on, makes this point while he's in college, in fact. And it's very interesting to see that this is somebody who is still a young man, is still very much in college, and is still making points like this, right? Um, and it's speaking to a developing vision for what he believes an independent India should uh, imbibe as a post-colonial country. It's also important to note that obviously this is 1914 to 1918. We are ages away from independence. We are ages away from defining who we are as a nation. But we are taking the first steps towards that. And this is a young man who is taking those first steps along with the country. And he's doing so at a time when England is also deeply suspicious of the Indian diaspora. You have Madan Lal Dhingra having assassinated an India House official in 1909. You have V.D. Savarkar, arriving at India House at this point in the early 20th century. So it is a time when the empire is keeping a very strict watch on young Indians in England and what these young Indians are talking about, what subjects they're discussing, what debates they're having. They have no desire, particularly during an atmosphere of war, particularly afterwards, because it's war that essentially teaches the empire how valuable India is, both strategically as well as economically. So it has no desire to let these so-called radical nationalists derail that overall agenda. And Panikkar, along with hundreds of others, are surveilled by Scotland Yard. Um, you have the empire keeping a very strict watch on his views, and there are files that basically talk about the dangers of his outspokenness. Um, and it's interesting to see that he doesn't stop talking about what it means to be Indian, despite this constant sort of cloud of being watched, so to speak. And he comes back to an India that's changed almost forever, right? The First World War leaves an intense impact, not just on his home state of Travancore, which is going through a famine at this point, but India itself is really struggling to cope post the First World War. There's a Spanish flu outbreak, there's unemployment, there's inflation, we're looking at debt. It's a very, very difficult situation economically, and this is quite apart from the political situation. He's come back and witnessed Jallianwala Bagh as well. He's read about it. It has shaken the country, and he's aghast. He's aghast that this is not being discussed more in international conferences because the world is still discussing the end of the First World War, right? The Treaty of Versailles is about to be signed, and yet an atrocity like Jallianwala Bagh is barely even mentioned. So moments like this strike Panikkar deeply, right? So you have these two parallel events taking place. You have the horrors in Jallianwala Bagh. You also have a moment of immense significance with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles because it is also signed by Maharaja of Bikaner, right? The Maharaja of Bikaner pen and signature is on that document, and it is at the signing of the Treaty of Versailles that Bikaner actively says and reminds the world, and he's standing alongside world leaders from the United States and from France and from the United Kingdom. And he basically says to the world that, we have to remind you that India represents 1/5 of the total human race. So it's also a world where the princes are now sitting up and saying, okay, we deserve to be counted for our assistance to the empire at a time of war. So now you have the princes entering any consideration of nationalism as well. Um, Panikkar, however, is occupied with more practical things. His mother wants him to get married, which is what he does. And so obviously he needs a job as well with a new young wife and a home to look after. He joins Aligarh Muslim University in the history department at this point. And for him, he feels that, okay, this is possibly a good place to start. It's possibly a good life to have because he's always been academically inclined. He's always been very keen to engage with India's history, with India's developing sense of self. And you see a constant sort of outflow of this happening at Aligarh. And it's in fact at Aligarh that Panikkar begins putting out works of history at this point, and he begins looking at where India used to be. And in all of his works, and I'm giving a very bird's eye view here because honestly, the works that he's written defy enumeration almost. So, in almost all the works that he writes, all of them have the same theme, whether he's writing about Harsha or whether he's writing about anyone else. It's basically how a strong, syncretically minded ruler can unite a fragmented, fissured land. And you see a new sort of element entering his writing at this point. You see him talking about unity. Now, why is he talking about unity? It's also because he's taking note of what's happening both across the world and at home, which is also the rise of the Khilafat movement, which is also the rise of a very strong pan-Islamic movement. And you see also the horrors of Chauri Chaura happening at this point in 1922. Um, for Panikkar, it brings home the fact that no amount of discussion on Indian nationalism would be complete without taking into account the fact that communal fissures will not lead the country anywhere. One has to be a united, cohesive entity in order to achieve some semblance of independence. Um, and you see him beginning to sort of take into account all these different threads. So he's taking into account the fact that this is a country that is prone to communal disharmony. You see him taking into account the fact that, uh, you know, the empires very easily let go atrocities like Jallianwala Bagh. It's not in the empire's interests to uh, be even remotely humane about something like that. Um, he also sees, the fact that the princes are now getting distinctly restless, and any idea of India that must develop must do so with the princes on board. Um, all of this cohesively brings home to him, and this is within a very short span between 1919 to 1922, and it sort of drives home, even to me when I'm putting a story like this together, the fact that so much is happening within such a short span of time that this is now a man who is turning away from academia and saying, okay, I want to do more. I want to get involved in politics. I want to push the country towards independence any way I know how. So by 1922, he puts in his papers at Aligarh Muslim University and he says, okay, let me figure out what I need to do next in order to contribute to that idea of India. And I think, this next decade that he sort of embarks on between, the 1920s, the mid 1920s to the whole of the 1930s, I think is one of his most intellectually rich moments. And this is literally saying something considering Panikkar's intellectual output rarely flagged, right? Um, this is a point at which you see him sort of now dabbling with the idea of being a journalist. And it's interesting to me that he chose this path in order to sort of get into politics. But then, if you sort of zoom out and take into consideration the fact that in those days, journalism was actually a very valid stepping stone towards politics. It was one of the best ways to sort of be a patriot, so to speak, right? You could put your voice out on any cause that you supported, and it would be counted. That voice would be counted. Um, and he dabbled in journalism for a bit at Swarajya, which is essentially this crowd-funded newspaper from the Madras presidency. It's run by a man called T. Prakasam. Uh, Panikkar is not very good at being a journalist because he's too interested in also dabbling in local politics at the time. Uh, because essentially that is what he wants to do. And he's very interested in taking on corruption. He's very interested in training his editorial guns at the governor of Madras, who was Willingdon at the time, who would become one of our viceroys later, which is really not what the editors at Swarajya wanted him to do. And also, very interestingly, at this point, he gets involved with the rising temple entry movement in Travancore. Um, Again, this is not something that his editor wants him to do, but it's also a cause that Panikkar sees as important because at this point you have the Congress being distinctly ambiguous towards being involved with the princely states. Gandhi was not ready to get the Congress involved in anything to do with the princely states because he didn't want to antagonize local Maharajas. And it was the same case with the temple entry movement. Now, what was important here for Panikkar was that, it was a great cause politically because, and also socially, right? He could appeal to Gandhi in this sense by, uh, pointing out to him the virtues of sort of clubbing untouchability with a wider national movement. Nothing comes of this, of course, because again, Gandhi is not ready, and the Congress is far too ambiguous about its stand towards the princely states at this point. But it's one of the ways in which Panikkar is now beginning to sort of double down on the fact that princely states have to be brought on board an idea of a united India. He's still very scornful about the princely states, however. Okay, so if you read his early writings on the princely states, you would never believe that this is somebody who actively went to bat for the princes, right? Because he's very, very scornful of the princes. He says that they're ruled by backstairs intrigue, and he says, all they can think about is their zananas, and he's very, very dismissive initially. And this is oddly paradoxical because he does recognize their value also. Um, and again, it's a view that you see him developing with time because he watches what the princes are doing at this point. And the mid 1920s is a very interesting time to watch the princes actually because they have been pushing for greater rights and for greater acknowledgement of who they are since the end of the First World War. And the princes of India, it's very easy to lampoon. It is and it was very easy to lampoon them because they were so easily cartoonish, so many of them. You had the Maharaja Alwar who believed he was the incarnation of Lord Ram and he thought nothing of setting his polo pony on fire because it didn't perform according to expectation. You have the Maharaja of Patiala whose hedonism was legendary even then. And it was very easy to sort of dismiss the princes as being complete cartoon characters. But these were also very erudite, very articulate men who were very capable of putting together very strong, intelligent plans for their own constitutional features. You see that with Alwar, you see that with Bikaner, you see that with Patiala. Certainly, you have princes who uh, thought themselves a touch above the rest, like Hyderabad, for instance. Uh, but by and large, they were also princes who were not unintelligent. And Panikkar is watching all of this. Panikkar is realizing that, okay, these are people who want to be counted. Underneath all of this flash and sort of exaggerated, caricatured behavior, these are people who would like to be counted. And from the mid 1920s is when you see Panikkar's view about the princes beginning to change and his view about how the Congress should deal with the princes also beginning to change. And this is all speaking towards, a developing idea of India that Panikkar is beginning to develop at this point. And you see it throughout wherever he is in the 20s or the 30s. So from Swarajya, for instance, he goes as Gandhi's emissary to Amritsar. And in Amritsar, you have, a very sort of flashpoint situation developing with the Kali movement. And he is basically sent by Gandhi and Nehru to sort of be the Congress public relations person to sort of see to it that what are the sort of opportunities for the Congress on the ground to sort of put down organizational roots, to put down political roots? Uh, should the Congress support the Akali movement? Uh, all of these are reports that he's sending back to Gandhi and Nehru at this point. And, you know, his diplomacy and Amritsar aside, you also see Panikkar now realizing that the Congress needs to stop being ambiguous, that more and more princely states will become important in taking even small political calculations going forward. So if the Congress is looking to back the Akali movement in a princely state, then, it needs to also get involved with other princely states, such as the temple entry movement in Travancore, for instance. So he sort of uses this successful diplomacy that he does in Amritsar to sort of go and tell Gandhi that, okay, this has been sorted out by the Congress and, it's been resolved with Congress satisfaction and to Akali satisfaction. How about you pay attention to the temple entry movement in Travancore now? Um, it's also from here that you see him sort of using his network with the Akalis to found what becomes the Hindustan Times. And while he is editor of Hindustan Times for a very short period, a little less than a year, it is with the Hindustan Times also that you see Panikkar's idea of India and what it should be coming out very strongly, because as the editor of Hindustan Times, what he does is use his networks, and by this point he's networked with a lot of prominent Indian nationalist leaders, Sarojini Naidu, Rabindranath Tagore, Nehru, Gandhi. Gandhi, in fact, inaugurates the Hindustan Times. The first issue alone has this front page, which has messages from all of these people speaking about how important it is to A, overthrow the Raj, but also B, pushed for a united India. So it's automatically setting a very nationalist tone. It's automatically setting the kind of message that Panikkar wanted to send to a reading public, which was essentially, again, you see the themes of unity coming in because there are numerous editorials that he runs saying that India cannot progress towards any sense of cohesion without uh, doing away with communal officials, doing away with political officials. There must be harmony across the board in order to achieve any kind of stability. You also see Panikkar pushing for the Congress to be more involved with the princely states. You see Panikkar taking on corrupt state governments. You see Panikkar calling out, viceroy's misdeeds. Again, not the kind of journalism that a newspaper was ready for at that point, and he gets eventually shunted out in favor of more right-wing management at that point. But what he takes away from this is that A, journalism is not for him, and B, there are many ways in which uh, media can be used to spread propaganda and to spread the right kind of message. So a difference between political propaganda versus the right kind of political messaging at a time when the country needs it the most. Um, After he leaves the Hindustan Times is when his career is a bit of a standstill, and this is one of my favorite parts of his life actually. He basically goes to England to train as a lawyer. He takes with him a tract that he has written about the princely states and a possible blueprint for bringing them on board a vision for a united India, which is federation. While that is being read and sort of accepted, that manuscript is when he sort of travels through Paris and Berlin, and this is between 1925 and 27. And it's actually a time when he's not mentioned this at all in his memoir, by the way. He's dismissed two of, I think, what were some of the couple of the most intellectually rich years of his career, in fact, because he dabbles in anarchism at this point. And Paris and Berlin are humming centers for imperialist dissidents, are massive underground networks of resistance against the empire. Um, and Panikkar gets very rapidly involved in this in Paris. and very happily involved as well, right? Because these are young men and women who are doing exactly the kind of journalism that he's always longed to do. So it's not just public relations for individual nationalisms. It's also, you're allowed to be angry and you're allowed to sort of put out blueprints for what you feel your own country should aspire to. And he's meeting all kinds of people at this point. He's meeting Indonesians, Algerians, Vietnamese, Chinese. It opens his eyes to the fact that each region, particularly Southeast Asia, and you see him be incredibly influenced by both China and Southeast Asia at this point. Um, each region comes with its own experience of nationalism, its own historical influence as well, and how that has sort of been influenced and is being influenced by nationalism, by empire, by rising currents of fascism even. It's a very, very intellectually vibrant time to be in Europe at this point, and you see Panikkar's whole um, sense of what India should be, particularly as an independent country, beginning to shift. He now begins thinking of India in a larger region, in a region of Southeast Asia. He begins pushing for a greater understanding of a shared civilizational history between, say, India and China, right? And again, you see this coming back when he is serving in China later, right? Like this kind of civilizational ethos that both India and China share. Um, for him becomes very important because he says, look, um, Asia can rise with India and China being partners, so to speak. You cannot do away with colonialism without counting Asia and Africa. These are regions and countries that must be counted. Um, and it's an actually, he brings this back to him later with him when he comes back to India. He brings this greater, more cosmopolitan experience of nationalism, of a quest for self-determination back to India, and it informs so much of his work. And this is yet another thing that I find fascinating about Panikkar's sort of evolution of the idea of India is that he would always learn from where he was at a particular moment in time. And he would never stop applying that to where India stood at that moment. He never stopped sort of bringing that back and sort of using it to explain where India could go um, at a time when it was possibly free. And for him, there was no question that India would be free. It just needed to have a blueprint to get there. Now, federation becomes one of the main causes with which he becomes associated throughout the 1930s in particular, because for him, this is the only answer. This is the only way in which princes can be united with provinces, and a sort of united form of India could emerge at this point. Um, and the cause of federation is actually supremely interesting because it's also driven so much by an emerging legal understanding of what India should look like, a constitutional understanding of what India should look like. That is what comes into play at this point. And the 1930s are actively a time when you see Panikkar, uh, he's serving Kashmir at this point, he's serving Patiala at this point, he's also starting to serve Bikaner towards the end of the 1930s. Um, and it's a fascinating time to be associated with the princely state and with the cause of federation because you have the national movement, meeting certain periods of ebbs and flows. You have the Dandi March happening in 1930. You have civil disobedience movement. You have constant pushes and pulls to understand what India's place in empire should be. And a lot of it is informed by what is happening abroad. You have dominion status, which is one of the phrases that is floating around at this point, particularly after the Balfour Declaration in 1926. Now, dominion status essentially meant that you would be a self-governing entity within a larger empire. Um, the first roundtable was marked by so much of that because you have Panikkar representing the princess, and he wasn't the only one representing the princess. There was a big delegation that went to represent the princess as well as the princes themselves. Uh, they were pushing for federation. There were also princes within that royal delegation who had wanted nothing to do with federation. You had political leaders, Indian national leaders there who were still pushing for dominion status versus federation versus a very angry Muslim League pushing for safeguards for Muslims within a wider concept of India. So you have conflicting ideas of India also developing. I think the round table, the first round table at least, was a huge mirror for that. We all know that it tanked eventually, but the 1930s, apart from giving us the Government of India Act 1935, which for somebody like Panikkar was a great win because he was trying to convince so many of the Chamber of Princes at this point that this was the biggest win that they were going to get from the Raj at this point. It was a big constitutional landmark for us. He could not make the princes see that because at the end of the day, and this is where so often ideas get derailed by personalities and by egos and by power plays. I think the Chamber of Princes was hugely representative of that in the 1930s. You see so many princes working against each other, so many, uh, you know, bridling at the suggestion of joining an Indian federation or signing up, even a prototype of the instrument of accession. It wasn't even the real deal that VP Menon and Sardar Patel would use in 1947. It was just a prototype. But you still have princes, for lack of a better phrase, freaking out essentially, because nobody understood what it meant among the princes to join a federation. They were too caught up in personal sort of fears about what that would mean for their rights, for their privileges, for their senses of territorial sovereignty, for their senses of what paramountcy meant to them, for what their gaddis meant to them. Um, and you see that sort of um, interplay of egos and personalities derailing the entire federal process, which comes to a complete and grinding halt by 1939 because you have the Second World War breaking out. You have Lindlitko sending the country to war without so much as a bio leave. You have the Congress ministries resigning as well. There had been an election for the first time in India's history in 1937 as a result of the Government of India Act 1935. All of this was pushing the country towards figuring out what it wanted. But as much as Panikkar tried to convince the princess that this was the best chance at a united country, as much as he was derailed by this fact, and this failure sort of was one of his greatest disillusionments at this point, um, because I think the 1930s for him represented his greatest push towards what an idea of India could look like if federation came to be. So from the 1940s now, you have a country that is, on the fast track towards what independence might look like. You also have the Second World War, which has broken out. And it is at this point that you see Panikkar engaging with the idea of India very differently, right? So he has joined the state service of Bikaner at this point, and you see him contributing uh, to even well, larger historical aspects of what India should be. So while he's in Bikaner, for instance, he invites Orelstein to come in and excavate what he believes should be the early sites of the lost Indus Valley civilization. And it's interesting that he makes this choice because Orelstein at this point is, nearing the end of his career. He's 80 years old. He's also had a very checkered career. He's known to have looted wildly across the Silk Road, and he's invited to Bikaner by Panikkar. And it's a world that is engaging also with different parts of its own history, right? You have the world is on the cusp of radiocarbon dating. You have, this shepherd boy in the Middle East, sort of tossing a stone into a cave and discovering what became the Dead Sea Scrolls. So it's also a world of very vibrant archaeological discovery. it's interesting to me that Panikkar is also engaging with this idea of India also with a historical, archaeological, cultural idea of India as well. This was an idea that was not for him only political. It was not only constitutional. It was always also involving um, history and a historical starting point as well for the country. Um, and you see that in the kind of writing that he's doing now, in the kind of work that he's doing in Bikaner, in the kind of stance that he's taking as far as the princely states are concerned, and the kind of disillusionment that he has as well. It's at this point that he writes a letter to his friend from Aligarh, Said Mahmood. It's 1941, and he writes, Said, we need to, words to the effect, this is not a direct quote, but he basically says, listen, we need to forswear any idea of a united India that we had, and I am now a Pakistanist, and Pakistan is an inevitability at this point. Um, and it's 1941, the Lahore Resolution has taken place. Jinnah has already, made this whole claim for a two-nation argument in Lahore. Um, Without, of course, using the word Pakistan, but the idea of Pakistan is very much in existence at this point. And I think Panikar's disillusionment with the cause of federation, his disillusionment with the idea that that one goal for him came to nothing, really left him feeling incredibly disillusioned. And I think it happens a lot when you have an idea that sometimes comes to nothing, or you feel that it's come to nothing. Um, what is interesting though is that he never stopped pushing toward what freedom could still mean, irrespective. You see him beginning to speak about foreign policy also at this point, right? In the 1943, for instance, he puts out a tract on our post-colonial maritime policy. And it's interesting that he does that at this point because the world is still at war. We are still a colony. Um, He has, however, seen what Japan is capable of. He's capable of seeing what uh, Japan has transformed itself into this juggernaut that has sort of raged across the Pacific, that's arrived at our doorsteps in the Northeast. His takeaway from this is that we should not forget that historically speaking, we had a very strong seaboard at one point. We should revive that idea of a strong seaboard. We should set up what he called a sort of steel fences with posts across Singapore, across Sri Lanka, across Yemen, across Singapore. He even argued for the importance of a regional order, which would sort of in the Indian Ocean, which would have the Great Britain, Australia, South Africa in important positions. Um, this to me is remarkable because he is arguing for this at a time when we are still years away from freedom, but he's already thinking of India as a free nation. He's already thinking of what the implications of decolonization would be. He's also thinking of um, our priorities and our foreign policy and geostrategic policies. He's even writing about the importance of air power at this point because he's seen the incredible use of air power in the Second World War. And he's basically now saying, look, historically and geographically, yes, the Himalayas, for instance, are a very strong natural barrier, but with the development of air power, we can't take them for granted and we can't lean on them as we historically once did. We must have air power that supplements our naval power as well. Um, these are remarkably practical calls also, right? These are not just idealistic visions of India. These are very practical uh, priorities that a post-colonial nation should look at. Um, and eventually, he's also writing many pieces at this point. Uh, he writes in Foreign Affairs, for instance, reminding the world and reminding Indian national leaders that you cannot discount the princely states no matter what happened to federation in the 1930s. The princely states must be taken care of and must stand up and be counted in any democratic process. Because at this point, and this is the early 1940s, he's also noticed that people's movements in the princely states are at their peak. They have been rising since the 1920s. They have been gaining momentum in the 1930s. They are now incredibly strong. And he reminds the princess constantly that, look, the writing is on the wall. At some point, you are going to have to acknowledge the fact that any kind of constitutional reform will mean that you join a union of India. What that looks like for you is something that needs to be debated and needs to be discussed. And these are attempts that run parallel to attempts that Indian national leaders are making throughout the late 1940s, right? You have Nehru, Sardar Patel, Gopalaswamy Iyengar, V.P. Menon. These are all people who are constantly also engaging with the princes. And this is apart from, the constant, stream of talks that are being held and that are constantly failing, whether it's between national leaders and Whitehall or whether it is between Gandhi and Jinnah. Irrespective, you still have a push to engage the princes to come on board and a united India. Um, so you have Panikkar's attempts again, sort of running parallel to this, and indeed being part of it throughout the late 1940s as well. Um, when you have transfer of power and partition, his first experiences with freedom, and this is the same with most officials who dealt with uh, transfer of power and partition at this point, was a complete and utter shock that the first images of a free India was immense bloodshed, immense death, and immense tragedy. Freedom came at a cost. But you see a Panikkar who is completely unfazed also in one part of his brain, because he's still continuing to write, he's still continuing to discuss what an idea of India would mean. Now, this is a part of his career that goes into representing India on a world stage. And that is, a whole other subject altogether, and I won't get into that. But what is important is that throughout the 50s and throughout the 60s, you see a man who is constantly putting out books on history, books on foreign policy. He's writing his work on Indian history at this point. A survey of Indian history is remarkably seminal. And it's essentially history written for Indians by an Indian, right? So he reminds us that, okay, the empire was just a phase towards an eventual unification of ourselves. Um, we need to reclaim our sense of history and our knowledge of history and not let our history be told to us by foreigners. We need to be aware of who we are as a country and who we always have been as a country. Um, you see also him, and this is, I think, one of the later areas in which he shapes the idea of India, is where he represents the States Reorganization Commission, and he comes back to India after representing us in China and in Egypt. And he basically has long held the view that if you encourage regional nationalisms, if you encourage linguistic nationalisms, you will ultimately undermine an overall sense of nationalism that is important for patriotism. Um, and much of this is in line with what Nehru feels also, right? Because Nehru, in the aftermath of transfer of power and partition, and this is despite a long-standing Congress policy of linguistic reorganization, but Nehru has changed his mind in the aftermath of partition. Nehru now feels India doesn't need to undergo further reorganization. We've barely recovered from partition. We have ongoing trouble in Kashmir and Hyderabad. There is no way that we should undertake linguistic reorganization so soon. And he calls Panikkar back in 1955 from Egypt, and he says, this is the brief. The brief is, I don't want a linguistic reorganization, but can something be done while ensuring that we stay cohesive as a country? And you have Panikkar now deviating from his own idea that, okay, linguistic nationalism wasn't the best idea, to actually presenting a report that does call for linguistic reorganization. And on top of that, also calls for the bifurcation of Uttar Pradesh. Now, he does this in order to maintain what he says is federal unity. He says this is the only way that you can stay cohesive. This is the only way in which you can stay united is if you acknowledge the fact that on the ground, the interests of linguistic nationalisms win out. And it's not a report that makes Nehru pleased at all. In fact, Nehru hates it. But what is important here is that Panikkar's idea of what India should look like continues to change with time. It continues to evolve as India evolves. Now, he's still writing about um, India in the sense of Greater India until you have about the mid 1950s. That is when it's becoming distinctly problematic. It's starting to become distinctly insular and chauvinistic. Again, it's not supremacist. And I think we tend to forget the ideological difference between being problematic or conservative and being outright supremacist. Uh, Panikkar fell into the former category where it was distinctly problematic in a world that was being defined by decolonization, where the world was looking at Cold War, where India was looking to sort of present itself as the arbiter of sort of Asian peace and Asian power. Uh, to talk about something like Greater India, and he adapts this phrase, right? He's no longer using Greater India in the 1950s. He's using something called Further India, which is essentially the same thing. Um, just differently phrased. But he does realize that it's becoming problematic because now when you're talking about that, it's it's risking the erasure of many marginalized communities that did and do play an important role in making our country what it is. Um, Ultimately, you see him dropping the phrase altogether because I think he begins to realize that, okay, this is now becoming very difficult to adhere to, even as a phrase in this day and age. Um, as he's getting older, though, you are seeing him, and he's by 1959, he's had a massive stroke. He's had to sort of curtail a lot of his work, a lot of his travels. He's still writing a lot, but these are the last years of his life. And you see a Panikkar who is almost defiant at this point. This is when much of his writing becomes problematic because now he is becoming uh, much more conservative in his views of nationalism. He is also becoming somebody with whom the first time Nehru disagrees strongly with, right? So many of his arguments about uh, a religious nationalism, many of his arguments about what our national language should be. And these are subjects on which he's been very secular in the past. But now, for instance, he says, okay, Hindi should be our national language. And Nehru's questioned about this by a French journalist, and he said that, look, you have somebody in public service who is saying this. What are your thoughts? And Nehru is visibly discomforted, and he says, look, we are not a country that subscribes to any particular language. We have a multitude of languages, and it is our duty to protect and preserve and uphold each of those languages. Um, the point here also is the diversity of ideas of India that are developing and that have always existed. Panikkar, I think, was very emblematic about what uh, the extent of those ideas were, the fluidity of those ideas also, the fact that none of these ideas were uh, particularly hardline, hardcore, or muscular in any sense of the word. Um, yes, there were problems as he grew older and as he sort of leaned very heavily on Hinduism as the crux around which the country should unite. Um, those were definite problem areas in the development of an Indian idea, particularly as a post-colonial nation. Uh, but it does not take away from the fact that these were ideas that you could not look away from. These were ideas that everyone in that generation, in that day and age, whether it was Nehru or whether it was Panikkar's own colleague, uh, could not ignore. They all engaged with those ideas. And I think therein lies one of his greatest legacies. Apart from much of the seminal work he did, was the fact that this was a reminder, I think, and while I was writing this biography, it sort of brought that home to me so many times, was that no matter how much you disagreed with certain ideas of what this country should be, there was always space for different ideas to exist. I think Panikkar's ideas of this country, as they developed through the freedom movement and after, are deeply emblematic of that space and that sort of fluidity of that space. So that brings me to the end of this presentation. So Malar, over to you and to any other questions that the audience might have at this point.
Thank you, Narayani. And before I sort of mention my thoughts, um, there's one question I would like. So Uday's question is, since Panikkar was a strong votary for a united India, what was his reaction to his home state of Travancore opting for independence from a united India?
So Panikkar actually had this long-standing um, enmity. It was sort of this love-hate relationship that he had with C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer. Um, he really was not in favor of any state opting for independence from a united India because, according to him, that was not something that was either geostrategically possible or plausible, nor was it something that could be possible in any vision of a united India. And you see that in the ongoing arguments that he has with C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer throughout the Chamber of Princes in the 1930s, and indeed after. His main aim was always to bring the princes on board. So he was definitely not in favor of Travancore opting for independence from a united India.
Uday, I hope that answers your question. Anandi has a question. What was his take on the woman question and on the disadvantaged sections of society?
I don't know what the woman question means, so I try to answer that as best as I can. Um, you in the early parts of his memoir, it sort of struck me because this was a man who was a father to four daughters. He was very much in favor of educating women and ensuring that um, they had rights. But if you see the early writings, and this is when Panikkar is a very young man, um, he basically says that as long as it does not interfere with the family and the family system of Indian society, then it's fine, right? So there are elements of definite sexism and chauvinism, but somehow, as he grows to be the father of four daughters, you see a very different sort of take towards women emerging because as somebody who as somebody who was the father to four daughters, he was an incredibly progressive father as far as encouraging them to have minds of their own, careers of their own, ideas of their own were concerned. He encouraged his daughters to debate with him on anything that he was reading or writing at any particular point in time. There was never a question of speaking to them or treating them as intellectually unequal. Uh, a couple of his daughters, in fact, contributed to a lot of the novels, etc., which he was writing at the time. Um, so you see a sort of contradiction and paradox in that, but overall I think he was remarkably uh he grew to be remarkably progressive about women in general. As far as the disadvantaged sections of society are concerned, and I think this ties in with Uday's next question, which is the temple entry, Panikkar's involvement with the temple entry movement. I think he was very pro helping the disadvantaged sections of society. And he did this also from a very politically um, um, advantageous sort of point because he saw that the moment was ripe for a national party like the Congress to get involved with something like a temple entry movement, for support to be given to that movement, and for the importance of bringing untouchability on board with an overarching national movement. And you see him going out of his way to sort of help that happen. So, for instance, he becomes friends with T.K. Madhavan, and T.K. Madhavan at this point is looking for somebody in the Congress to support, the cause of the temple entry movement. And Panikkar at this point says, Panikkar is working in Swarajya at this point. This is when Panikkar is attempting to be a journalist for the first time in his life, but also getting involved with politics like this. So Panikkar basically said, look, I can't introduce you to Gandhi just yet, but why don't you come with me? A friend of mine is currently president of the Congress, friend of his being Muhammad Ali, who was president of the Congress session being held at Kakinada. And he basically tells his editor at Swarajya that, look, I am going to report at the Congress session and, I'll send reports from there. He doesn't tell his editor what he's actually planning to do, which is to introduce T.K. Madhavan to Muhammad Ali to sort of ensure that the cause for the temple entry movement is heard by the Congress. And in fact, that is one of the resolutions that is passed by the Kakinada session at that point is that temple entry is the right of all Hindus. And that is a lot of that is due to Panikkar's involvement behind the scenes there.
Great. I hope, Uday, that answers your question. And Anandi has also just confirmed, Narayani, that yes, it was, the women's question is about women's education and their social status. So
Yeah, no, he was
I
very,
hope,
he
yeah,
grew to be very, very, very progressive about women's education and their social status. In fact, if you read the book, you'll discover that he was a great fan of very intelligent, very strong-minded women.
yeah, great. So I know it's already 19 minutes past 7. So I probably had a couple of thoughts which will take us another hour. So I'm not getting into the aspect of, how did you really sort of go through this journey of, your first book from 2020 to 2022 to, how this came about, because probably that could be another sort of, 1 hour discussion that we could have. It's fascinating to also just look at very interesting aspect of the Hindustan Times and its genesis, which I personally was not aware about. But Narayani, beautiful sort of narration of right from the intro to the university years to uh, Panikkar's time at Aligarh University, then an evolving idea of India to the independence in India in 1940s, and then to the 1950s and 60s, and now probably we know as to you know him being an anarchist, a novelist, a poet, a lawyer, a historian, a journalist, a foreign policy mandarin, and an academic. And probably that's why you've aptly titled the book A Man of All Seasons. So, thank you for taking us through this journey. And, just in case people have missed out, the book title is A Man for All Seasons.
Thank you,
I think,
Uday. Thank you.
yeah. Yeah, so wonderful narrative, and thank you again, Narayani. It was very insightful.
Thank you so much, Malhar, and thank you to everybody who took the time out to be here this evening.